Well, the stack site. Actually, can I ask you first?
Yeah.
The name of the beach.
Trina Uvag.
Trina Uvag.
I think it's pronounced.
Trina
And
Uvag.
it's beach of. It's beach of the caves. It means caves. Although, interestingly enough, I was just checking this before I came out this evening. The actual word Uvag that's on the map means louse, lice,
Right.
that type of thing, and a slightly different spelling means caves. But I think it's probably misspelt on the map,
Right.
because there are caves on the beach.
Yeah.
So I think we would go with the definition that it's the beach of the small caves.
Okay. Trina Uvag.
Uvag. Yes.
Okay. Because I'll refer to it as that. Differentiate it from the township remains.
Yeah.
Well, the little stack we've been digging at Trina Uvag, very interesting in its own right, certainly. We don't know the date yet, but it's there's still a very good chance that it's early Christian monastic site. Certainly nothing to suggest otherwise. We've got this lovely little structure that could be a chapel with an apse and paved floor, and another building that was probably for domestic use for sleeping and cooking. We don't really have enough yet to tell the whole story, but certainly enough to go on to say it's potentially a early Christian date. If it were late Iron Age, you'd expect lots of pottery, you'd expect different sorts of artifacts. If it were much later, you'd again expect different sorts of artifacts. So the fact that we haven't found a lot with no pottery at all, with just a few stone tools, lots of firecracked stone would
Implies cooking, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In fact, because you use that to heat the water.
Exactly.
You heat your stones to heat the water.
People were living there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose it's the lack of artifacts, the fact that early Christian life was incredibly simple.
Yes.
You didn't have possessions. There was no possessions at all, because it was all contemplative stuff. You were there to pray and be close to God.
Yeah.
And so I was just telling the story to the kids in school the other day about Saint, can't remember, but the saint who was praying, and he was praying in the little hut, and he was down on his knees, and there was a small window. He looked out the window, and he had his hands out to God. He had one hand out to God with the palm facing up the way, and the bird landed in his hand and nested, laid the egg in the hand, and he stayed there in that position until the egg hatched. Supposedly, one takes that with a pinch of salt, but the point is, he was there, for the contemplation and the peace and the quiet and the sincerity. And I would imagine that's what the site and stack would have been for, cut off from everyday life.
Yeah, exactly.
So therefore, you wouldn't see much other than perhaps evidence of cooking, which is the only thing they would have done.
Yeah, and hardly any of these places have been excavated, so it's all new. It's not all new information that we're getting. But looking inland from the stack site, think about what if there were priests on that, living in some kind of remote meditative existence on that little stack. There must have been people also living on the mainland that they would have had some relationship with. Whether they were living exactly opposite in what became the township of Canabine, we don't know yet. Certainly parts of the township that look earlier, there's little fragments of walling, terraces, and could be of any date really, but they don't look particularly late.
No.
Look like they were earlier than the later.
That's why I think about the terracing. Those small little terraced areas do kind of suggest something fairly old. Because that's not a feature you find in later rural Scotland in the Highlands. Is the idea of terracing.
No.
That seems to suggest something certainly pre-Christian, something well back. But, so I suppose the clearing of very small areas and the building up of those very small cultivation patches. But
how large would a small cell or monastic site be? Inside, would it be totally covered with a roof and be able to be stood up in?
Well, all we've really got to go on are places where these little cells are preserved. Skellig Michael off the west coast of Ireland. There's an island I can't remember the name of now. Off just north of Jura, where their little monastic cells have been identified. So there were probably little individual buildings rather than one roof over the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they might have ranged from one single monk on his own to a few handful.
Mm-hmm. The site in Farratt Head, on the stack in Farratt Head, that was drawn in the 1960s by somebody. I've got a copy of that somewhere.
Raymond Lamb.
Yes, yeah. And that showed individual cells. I think it's 5 small cells. But to me, they just looked the size of just enough room to get into and possibly lie down in, maybe, but they were definitely very small. I think cells are a very appropriate word for them.
Yeah.
Very, very small.
Would a township like Canabeen have had some kind of religious church presence? Could it have developed because that site was there, or would that all have been linked to the Balnakeil Church?
Well, it's hard to say. Some townships, and certainly down the valley of Strathnaver, you find their chapel sites, which are probably maybe early Christian in date, 8th or 9th century, or a bit later, but they're certainly pre-Reformation, and they're in or near the township sites. Not usually in them, but they'll have the same name, and they're in modern times anyway, and they're you get a township cluster in the vicinity.
Yeah. So
it seems like they were linked to some settlement that supported the priest there, and the priest ministered to and said mass over them. So the people living along this coast in the medieval period would have had chapels and priests that served them, basically, and they supported in turn. Not necessarily each settlement had one.
No. It's quite possible that, I suppose, because just the soil evidence that's been dug up in the stack, the fact that soil appears to be good quality soil, it's light, it's rich, it's obviously drained the whole, as we know from Canabeen, the whole area is very green and it drains very well. The terracing, these other indications, there's probably been a settled community there for a very, very long time.
Yes.
So it might be that might be an attraction for the early Christian colonisation of the site, perhaps, or going there, the fact that you did have that remote stack that could be used as a quiet cut-off. And I suppose it's defensive as well, because if Christianity wasn't exactly being welcomed with open arms, there might have been that need for that little bit of defence. So maybe there was an existing community, and sufficiently far enough away from Balnakeil, perhaps, to warrant the presence of a priest. Who knows?
It's also possible that it was an earlier, it was used in, say, the Iron Age or something, a couple of thousand years ago. Because there's quite elaborate walls, the 3 walls going across the little neck of land that you cross. It's probably eroded away on either side, but there were originally 3 walls. Might be of different phases. Maybe it could be that it was originally a little Iron Age settlement on a stack, a little defended site, and then hundreds of years later, monks took it over and reused it.
Yeah.
So it's possible there's different.
Yeah. The fact that there seems to be that wall built along the top of the cliff as well, there's a lot of work gone into that, which again is just heightening the importance of the site. You don't go to all that bother of building that retaining wall on the top of the dike unless it's something important. It's, there's a lot more to that. Because I've been thinking about the stack site at between Achimore and Dal on the Kyle. I'll have to go back and see.
Can you walk out to it?
You can walk out to exactly the same setup as the one at Canabeen, but not as high. It's not nearly as dramatic, but you do go across the narrow spit of land. I think it's a longer spit of land. But my memory of that is it's just a rectangular turf wall.
Right.
There is no evidence of anything beyond that, whereas at Canabeen, of course, there's so much more there. But I wondered about, is there a link between like the Farratt Head, the Achimore, the Trine Uvig sites and Balnakeil? Would there be a link between sort of the mother church, the monastery, main settlement, and these perhaps almost contemplative sites
Yeah.
around about.
Well, the other thing that you've got around here is that you've got Balnakeal, and then down further up the Caledurnas, just past the Cape Wrath Hotel.
Yeah.
You've got
There's Achnahannock.
Achnahan,
Yeah.
exactly, Field
Yeah.
of the Annet, which is
Yeah.
land that belonged to an Annet, was an early church,
Yeah,
or
some sort of religious site, yeah.
some people think it was
Yeah.
a church that was already old by the 9th century,
Mhm.
or a mother church.
Yeah.
But it was farming land that belonged to an early church.
Yeah.
So we can say there was an early church
Yeah.
in that
Yeah.
vicinity, and it might well have had these little satellites.
Yeah.
And they would have been linked to, or there would have been communities of people, just lay people, that supported the...
Because it's always presumed that Balnakeal is where Christianity started, but it's quite possible that Achnahannock was the actual site where Milruva arrived and thought, "Wait, there's a nice green spot." First, don't know, because there is that very intriguing big L-shaped foundation at Achnahannock, which looks like an enclosure, but is at the basis of perhaps a large building. It's another excavation now.
So it's got to be looked at both in isolation and in context with the rest of the township. It can't have been, and it's not kind of. What's the next? What would we do next if we were going to go any further? I mean,
With the stack site?
yes.
Well, a radiocarbon date would be quite useful to just get, fix it in time, because at the moment it just gets work. So that would be useful, and it could be of different phases, but it would give us some idea of when the parts we've excavated were used. And if further excavation were to take place, it would be great to look at the rest of the little building with the paved floor and the curved end.
Absolutely.
They're really, hardly any of these have been looked at, so it's all just going to be new information. Very, very interesting to see.
I just think the fact that there is the potential, there is a little chapel there, because again, my understanding these stack sites really is towards the cellular thing, but if we've got a site with a possible small defined chapel as well as the sort of the general occupation buildings, I think that could be quite significant and certainly enhance the further understanding of early Christianity in the north.
Yeah.
So good source of funding, good argument for funding there.
Definitely. But also in terms of the kind of later activity at Canabine, I mean, the people living there, say up to the clearances, must have known about the stack site. They would have had their own stories about it. There's obviously no way of getting at those now.
No.
But they knew that landscape at the back of their hands as well. That they occupied all of it.
It's also interesting that we seem to be going definitely in line it was some sort of monastic religious site, and the fact that it was preserved locally, that it was a possible monastic site. That there must have still been people around when that was recorded that thought that knew. Because I'm fairly sure the first person that told me about that was the late Dr. Sandeman, who was responsible for a lot of the stuff on the SMR locally. Yes, SMR. And so he must have picked up at some point that there was a church there. Or
These
something.
stories get passed down.
And that's possibly what it was. Who knows? But I'd also like to see some work done down at Balnakeal on the buildings down there. There's supposed to be the remains of the monastery. I would love to establish if that little bit of wall and that remains what looks like a cellar, if that really is part of a monastic building, and somehow tie these sites into that, or whatever, or establish the date of that building. Because it's always intriguing the fact that the Balnakeal house was supposed to be the bishop's palace and there was supposed to be a monastery, and if we had actual evidence there of, even if it's a medieval monastery, that's that would change the complete understanding of the Christian church in the north, because monastic settlements are so few, and particularly sort of that medieval setup. Although it is at the other side of the road from the church, so it wouldn't be sort of the church and the cloisters, but there's no reason why the church at one side of the one side of the Burton and the monastic buildings at the other. Because there's absolutely no evidence of monastic buildings round about the church. None whatsoever. There's nothing in the field, there's nothing in the aerial photographs, I've tramped all around. Like, is there anything here? There's a possible longhouse just as you go in the gate of the field at the side of the graveyard, but it screams longhouse. It doesn't scream anything else. But then there's those buildings just beside the church, beside the house. That again recorded because I've got that record. God, I forgot his name, Chappie Mackay, who stayed at Balnakeil House in 1886, and he kept a diary, and that ended up in the National Library, and he records that was pointed out, that these ruins or remains beside the big house were pointed out to him as the remains of the abbey, of the monastery. So, yeah.
Well, going back to what you've just finished doing this week, is there anything you want to kind of clarify or say, or what is...
Well...
'Cause I think... Sorry, you've documented it fairly well. I mean, it's
Yeah.
nice going over and over. But
well, we can certainly say there were people living and cooking on the stack, and there was this other little building which seems to have had a very different use of the paved floor. So from a strictly technical point of view, that's all you can say. However, looking at its location, at all the effort that went into living there, and it was, it wasn't just a little temporary tent or something. It was pretty substantial buildings that people were constructing there. So I'm quite confident that it could be an early Christian monastic settlement, although we can't say for sure. But if we could get a date, that would definitely help pin it down in time. And I think once you have a sort of starting point, then you can work either back or forward from that. So it will be useful when we come back to survey the township at Canabine and start to make sense of all the stuff on the ground. And there's a hell of a lot of stuff to record and to make sense of, which we'll get there. But there's a lot. But it'll we can say, well, people were here from this point in time, and we can say, well, we can trace that through time, or maybe there was a interlude where nobody lived along that coast.
Yeah.
Although, looking at the topography and the fertility of this area, seems quite likely that there were always people.
People there for a very, very long time. Yeah. Because there's also those what I constantly refer to as the fallen monolith site, which is obviously very ancient. So there's obviously been human interaction there for at least a couple of thousand years, if not longer.
Yeah. And all the stuff around Loch Barley, certainly.
Yeah.
A couple thousand years old.
Yeah. A few thousand before that.
if all these people were still here, we would need your railway.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I think that's probably all we need at the moment, until stage 2 comes along.
Stage 2, yeah.